An Arkham Asylum series is coming to the soon-to-be rebooted DC universe. So this project was originally supposed to take place in the Matt Reeves Batman universe, which is supposed to remain independent as a DC Elseworlds project. But James Gunn recently confirmed that it's actually going to be a part of the new DCU, and that Matt Reeves will be making projects for both universes. We're gonna dig into what the show could look like, but I gotta start by saying that I am very happy to hear that it moved over to the main DCU. I really liked Matt Reeves' Batman movie, and I'm super stoked about all the sequels and spin-offs that are gonna take place in that world. But since that universe seems to have a much more realistic take on Batman and Gotham City, I wasn't really expecting too fantastic of an ensemble in Arkham. So far, we've only really seen Riddler, Catwoman, Falcone, and Penguin. These are all very realistic villains. None of them have any superpowers, which led me to believe that we wouldn't see some of the more fantastical Batman villains in this universe. But now that the project is moving over to the main DCU, which is already confirmed to have a bunch of metahumans with Superman Legacy, really anyone could work. Batman has a very diverse rogues gallery. He's got evil geniuses, he's got monsters, he's got freaks. There are so many characters that I've been wanting to see in a good live action picture, some of them for the first time and others for a chance at redemption. But first, let's break down what the premise of the show could be. I could see them going a few different routes for this show, but for it to fit in with an easily digestible superhero universe, I think this show would be really cool as a supervillain team up where Batman's most notorious enemies will, despite their utter distance from one another, work together and devise a convoluted plan to escape Arkham Asylum. The show could start off with them talking to each other from across their quarters. Some of them vibe and others can't stand each other. The show could even steal a page from Under the Red Hood, where somebody like Black Mask is trying to break Arkham residents out for his own personal gains. Or all of the tension could exist entirely in the asylum. We could see characters taking turns seeing Dr. Hugo Strange, who is the psychiatrist at Arkham. He could be the one pulling the strings. Maybe he's secretly feeding them info and trying to help them escape. Or I could see him being the antagonist of the show. He could be abusing them, experimenting on them, or manipulating them against each other. Even if it's not Strange, they do need to have some sort of antagonist if they're going the route of a serialized show. I don't really see it being Batman or anyone from the Batman family, since these characters are all locked up. Of course, they could have a confrontation with one or more of them upon their escape, since this would likely cause a ruckus, but they do need to have some sort of primary obstacle throughout the show. Of course, this being a series, this leads me to wonder how the escape plan would play out. Perhaps it's gradual throughout the show, or they could go the route of having the big escape as the climax of the show, or it could play out like a slow burn, where in episode 1, we see the big escape, or even just the aftermath of it. And each episode could detail the key events leading up to the escape, perhaps even giving each villain involved their own episode where they each take center stage. However it's plotted, it could play out like a prison drama where each villain is negotiating who to throw under the bus to make their own escape easier. We could see some serious survivor politics with something like this. We could even see some of them fail to escape while others get out, kind of like Suicide Squad-esque, where some of them succeed and others fail. Of course, the show could also just be totally episodic or play out like an anthology series where each episode is about a different Batman villain, and it's narrated by them talking to a psychiatrist in Arkham about how they ended up there. The show could even be like Marvel's What If, where each episode seems self-contained, but then by the end of the show, it all kind of ties together with one big Arkham Asylum escape plan. There are so many different ways they could make the show, and also so many different dynamics that the characters could have, which leads us to the big question: who all is going to be in the show? Every superpowered team up needs to have a diverse set of characters if it's going to be interesting. Some of these characters should clash both visually and narratively. If they're going the serialized route, there should be tension between them at all times. They're a bunch of villains after all. They should have a strong distrust in one another and constantly be at each other's throats. It would also make a lot of sense if they were each depicted in a way where they were clearly ruled in a court of law as not guilty by reason of insanity. So they should each clearly have something else going on psychologically for them to feasibly be put into Arkham Asylum rather than Blackgate Penitentiary. A lot of the characters I'm going to talk about did appear on the show Gotham, but let's not let a cliche network television show be the blueprint for this one. So I think the best way to speculate on what this team up could look like is by first organizing them into different character categories. Let's start with the freaks. So in classic Batman villain fashion, a lot of these characters should be depicted as unhinged and sadistic. Honestly, the bulk of Batman's villains could be put into the freak category because most of them can feasibly be written as a loose cannon. But we don't want to place everyone in this category because it would be completely uninteresting if all of them were completely mad. It can't just be all edgelords galore. So there are some characters I'm placing in this category not because they can't fit into the other categories, but because they fit too easily in this one. Either because they're traditionally depicted as a freak or because their fantastical nature is just kind of hard to take seriously. Victor Zsasz is the first to come to mind for this category because he's almost always been depicted as a murderer that is prone to carving someone up with a big old grin on his face. I do feel like his presence at Arkham is honestly just a given. I fully expect smaller Batman villains like him to appear here and there, either in small roles or in cameos. Mad Hatter is another one that's traditionally hard to take seriously, but there are ways they could make him more realistic. He could be totally delusional. Perhaps he's seeing his Alice's the same way Polka Dot Man saw his mom. They could even make him like Kilgrave from Jessica Jones, where he grew up with the curse of never having an organic interaction with another person. Or perhaps his mind control could be done through some sort of pheromone drug or serum. Ventriloquist could be an interesting one. The obvious hole you could poke is that they probably wouldn't let him keep Mr. Scarface in Arkham. Perhaps they've got the dummy locked up somewhere in Arkham, and as part of their escape plan, they break into a vault to grab some goods, and he grabs the dummy on the way out. That said, I don't think that he would be a very good primary character on the show. I think that he could be a good side character, adding a little bit of comedy here and there, acting as the Peter of the squad. Calendar Man could also be a good side character that's just there. I don't really see him being a main character that could drive the plot though, since his only shtick is committing crimes on holidays. Professor Pig is one that I would love to see, but I think it would be a bit hard to do justice behind bars since his whole thing is turning innocent people into Dolatrons. That said, with him arguably being one of the most disturbing Batman villains, they could make it so that he has a bit of a reputation at Arkham. Like the main characters are just sitting at a table in the cafeteria and then Pig comes in and sits down with them. And then some of them are just like, nope. And lastly, we have Scarecrow. I'm sure some of you could see him in one of the other categories, but I think that he'd best fit into this one. I think that it would be really cool to depict him in a way that perhaps after ingesting too many fumes from cooking up his fear toxin, he's fried a bit too many brain cells. We've already seen a solid live action depiction of him already, so I wouldn't mind seeing him play the role of the loose cannon here. Of course, I have not yet mentioned the most notorious freak of them all, but we'll talk about the Joker later. Of all these characters, I'd love to see Scarecrow and Mad Hatter the most. I think there's some potential with them to still be interesting in the asylum. We could see them break into the pharmaceutical lab at Arkham and make their respective concoctions for their fear toxin or their mind control substance. The asylum would most likely be full of different drugs that they give patients, especially ones needed to sedate the bronze in this next category. So in my opinion, every superpowered ensemble needs to have a tank, somebody who can step up and fight the masses when the team gets surrounded. It's almost a given that whenever there's a super team up, it culminates with them being outnumbered. These problems are typically best solved by brutes. For them to be kept at Arkham, they would have to have some sort of special facility better suited for containing them and preventing a rampage. They could easily have these characters loom through most of the show. Like we don't actually see them until one of the main characters visits their facility and talks to them through the bars, perhaps while security is down. Then when it's time to escape, they are released, and they pave the way for everybody else's escape by beating their way through security. Clayface is one that I would love to see get a solid live action depiction. It's obviously just hard to accomplish this because he's a giant humanoid wad of clay that shapeshifts into other people. The way I see it, there are two good ways to approach him. Solution one, size him down. He could just be an ordinary shapeshifter who, when he changes, looks gross, like a wad of clay. Of course, then he just wouldn't be a brute. Solution two, keep him big, but instead of making his oversized form mud-like, they could make him a deformed monstrosity where his skin pigment and cells are constantly shifting. With either solution, I could see him having a dissociative identity, earning him his spot at Arkham, kind of like an evil Moon Knight. This could even be what triggers his changes, and perhaps with psychiatric aid at Arkham, he learns to control them, counterproductively molding him into a better villain. I could actually see him being a big player in the show. He could transform into guards and walk other residents across the ground so that they can communicate without suspicion. There's also so much room for plot twists with a character so well suited to deceive others. Killer Croc is another one that can take a beating because he can be depicted as having bulletproof scales. He could tear down Arkham walls and act as a human shield for the other inmates escaping. With his original comic origin being that he's born that way as a member of society, he could have grown up with an extremely tough childhood filled with abuse. Think Carnage here, because that's what could earn him his spot in Arkham. I do personally prefer the Rebirth version of him, where he is depicted as pretty smart and is a big player in the Suicide Squad, but if he's gonna be in Arkham, then they obviously need for that to make sense. Bane is an option, but honestly, I don't think he'd be a good one. We've seen him depicted as a big dumb brute and nothing else, and it's literally his worst depiction. I think he's much better off as an evil genius and not just a tank, so let's not put him in Arkham. And then we have Solomon Grundy, who's arguably the best option. He's always been depicted with an IQ of -20, so there's a lot of room to depict him as a proper Arkham patient. He would also be the easiest to manipulate. The mastermind of the squad could talk him into breaking doors down when push comes to shove, and then easily abandon him after escaping. So besides Bane, I'd be happy to see any of these guys in the show, but I think Grundy is the easiest to incorporate without much of a need to make him very compelling. So the best team-ups include a diverse group of people. If you were hoping for an Arkham Asylum sausage fest, then I'm sorry, but we would be missing out on some great characters if we didn't talk about the girls. We need to break up the testosterone a bit, and Batman's gone up against a few badass ladies that could really contribute to this team up. The first one that I'm sure most of you are thinking of is Harley Quinn. She's the one character who, given her nature in most depictions, needs no explanation as to why she's locked up in Arkham. She could play many roles in this team up. She could be the loose cannon. She could be the comic relief. She could use her former employment at Arkham as a means of navigating the grounds. But I personally think that it would be much cooler to see her still working there as a psychiatrist. I think her origin story would be a great subplot for the show, because then we would be seeing the asylum from many different angles and not just from the patients. Of course, it depends on how she's introduced in Joker Folie à Deux. I've seen rumors that her origin in that is not going to be her traditional Arkham psychiatrist story. And if that's the case, then I think it would be perfect to use it in this show. She could be one of the employees who is slowly being bent throughout the show and being twisted around the thumb of the Joker, leading her to eventually aid his escape along with the other patients. She could also, through her job, build empathy for one Poison Ivy, which could be the start of their friendship. So Poison Ivy is one of the top DC characters in general that I want to see in the DCU, and this series would be the perfect place to introduce her. I can't stress this enough. The depiction in Batman and Robin just didn't do it for me. I would like to see a proper, sick and twisted eco-terrorist. Her compassion for the environment and disdain for humankind could make her one of the standout characters, because she would probably despise being trapped in a box with Gotham's worst criminals. I would love to see them go the route of making her able to control plants in a monstrous way. Perhaps the thing that aids the big escape is somebody smuggling in a plant or a seed, and she shapes it into a big monster that fights off the guards. Punchline is another that comes to mind, but honestly, that just wouldn't work unless the Joker already had Harley come and go from his life. And I'd much rather this show give us a more detailed origin story for her. And I'm sure some of you are thinking of Catwoman, but come on. She does not belong in Arkham. So among these characters, I'd love to see both Harley and Ivy. But if I had to choose just one, I'd choose Poison Ivy. I just think that she has much more potential to bring some much needed heart to this ensemble, which leads me to the next category.
Snow is beautiful, don't you think?
Like I said, this show will need more than just a bunch of edgelords. At least one of these characters needs to be somebody who we can have sympathy for. Like Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, we need someone who we can look at and almost feel bad for when we see how low they've gotten. Someone with a motive that we can at least kind of relate to. Ivy could fill this role by having an almost childlike love for plants and nature. She could be depicted very innocently and perhaps be played by a younger actress. There are a handful of characters that could feasibly be written as the heart of the group, but there is one big character that comes to mind, and that is obviously Mr. Freeze. Since the retelling of his origin story in the Batman the Animated Series episode Heart of Ice, this take on the character has essentially become his definitive origin. Every iteration that I can think of Victor Freeze that I've seen has adapted this origin, where he's a cryogenist trying to save his sick and dying wife Nora. It would make him such a compelling character if he were locked up in Arkham, unsure of his wife's current condition, and he's trying to break out so that he can try and save her. Of course, in order for us to have that sympathy for him, he should probably be depicted in a way that seems mostly sane. Whatever he has going on, I think, should be mostly kept at bay and only occasionally seep through the cracks so that we at least understand why he's in Arkham. I do wonder what sort of appearance he could have, though. Obviously, he'll be bald, but the real question is, Will he have the refrigerator suit? While most of us can suspend our disbelief in the more fantastical elements of comic adaptations, I do think this might be a little bit hard to get past. Alternatively, I think it would be a really cool nod to that aspect of the character if they just made certain parts of Arkham really cold. And unlike everyone else who's cold and shivering, he could just straight up have short sleeves and just feel fine because he just likes it cold and doesn't necessarily need to be freezing to stay alive. Aside from Freeze, the only other character who I think would be a good heart of the story is actually Two-Face. I could see them making him a bit more victimized after the accident that ruined his face. Perhaps in Arkham, he shares his hardships of feeling like an outcast and how most people can't look at him anymore. They could even incorporate his Long Halloween origin story, and he sits in Arkham thinking about his wife Gilda, wishing things had gone differently. There are some other characters that could potentially work in this role, but if there's really any character that deserves to be the heart of the story, it's totally Mr. Freeze. Dent is a close second, and of course they could incorporate both of the characters, but I think Dent is much better off in this next role.
Reborn. Resurrect.
So if there's gonna be a convoluted Arkham Asylum escape plan, there's gotta be somebody pulling the strings so that the escape can be executed perfectly. There are a bunch of asylum patients. They probably wouldn't do very well just improvising. They would need a mastermind to devise a plan. Whoever it is, I think they should be the main character of the bunch that the show primarily focuses on. And I think that Harvey Dent is perfect for this role. If you've never read The Long Halloween or watched the animated movies, definitely check them out, because that is the type of Two-Face that this show deserves. One that generally has gravitas, but obviously has something else going on under the hood. He could be the one trying to convince everyone to work together, and true to his namesake, he could even be a two-faced bastard with an ulterior motive. Perhaps he could convince Freeze to work with him by talking about trying to be with his wife Gilda, using relatability as a means of persuasion. He could even use his knowledge of law to try and blackmail corrupt Arkham staff like Hugo Strange or Harleen Quinzel. Someone that's very human and very well known should be center stage in this ensemble. And since The Dark Knight, Two-Face has become one of the more recognized members of Batman's rogues gallery. Of course, the other brainy Arkham resident that could fulfill the role of the Mastermind is Riddler. And honestly, he would be perfect for this role, but seeing as we literally just got a good live action depiction of him alongside Pattinson, I would prefer to see somebody else. I wouldn't mind seeing a more traditional depiction of the character, but there are just so many other great Batman villains that I think should get the spotlight instead. So Dent is definitely the character that I think should lead this ensemble. But of course there is one other character that could be the real mastermind.
Hurry up and take your seat, Batman.
So the Joker needs to be in this show. You can't have a show about Batman's greatest enemies without him. If the new DCU is going to have already established characters, then the Joker shouldn't be any different. No more origin stories and no more of him meeting Batman all over again. The Joker should be one of the more famed residents at Arkham. Others should be hesitant to work with him at first, and he should be a disturbance in whatever plan they have in motion. The real question is, which Joker should it be? And I'm not talking about actors. Obviously, they're gonna have a new person play him. I'm referring to the three different spins on the character that we've seen across many adaptations that were solidified in Batman 3 Jokers: the clown, the criminal, and the comedian. The clown is of course the goofy one, always cracking jokes and incorporating gags into his crimes. The criminal is much more serious and is better suited to lead an army of goons. This is the one that does the moniker Clown Prince of Crime the most justice. Then there's the comedian. This is the sadistic, demented monster that we're used to seeing nowadays. For an Arkham Asylum series, I think that they should lean harder into the comedian archetype than anything. With such a diverse group of criminals, I think that he needs to clearly be the most twisted of them all. That said, I don't think that the Joker should take center stage in this show. He is the icing on the cake, and having too much icing will overpower the cake. There's this one really cool bit in Batman Their Dark Designs that I think is relevant to this rant, where the Joker is talking about some of the other Batman villains, detailing their archetypes, and goes on to separate himself as something very different. It's a really cool bit that I don't want to spoil in case you want to read it, but it perfectly explains what separates him from them. So I think he should just be a proper supporting character, as he's generally always been, but one that doesn't fall into one of these aforementioned roles. Of course, he was the lead in the Todd Phillips movie, but that was a very different take on the character. No matter how much we see him in the show, I think that it would be great if, in the end, he had his own scheme all along. They could steal a page from Batman Assault on Arkham, where in the midst of all the chaos during the jailbreak, Joker's fighting off with our protagonist. More of a good reason to make it Two-Face, since neither of them have any superpowers and it would actually be a fair fight. So my overall dream cast for the show would put Two-Face at center stage, with Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, and Joker as the main supporting characters. And for the less relevant characters, I think that that Solomon Grundy, Scarecrow, and Mad Hatter would be solid choices. Hugo Strange could be our main antagonist, and I think Dr. Harleen Quinzel could just be a less relevant supporting character who, by the end of the show, gets twisted into being with the Joker. There are obviously so many ways that they could make this show, and I am beyond excited to see what they do with it. Of course, I'm curious to hear what you all think down in the comments. Let me know if there are any characters or any story arcs from the comics that you would really like to see in the show. But thanks for watching this video. Be sure to give it a like if it brought you any value, and definitely let me know in the comments if you want to see more speculative content like this. But I'll see you next week with my reviews of Lift and the Book of Clarence.